My name is Francis Levy, and I'm co-director of the Philoctetes Center. And Ed Nersessian is the other co-director. Welcome to the Critic as Thinker. Before we start this afternoon's roundtable, I have a couple announcements about future activities. But firstly, my first announcement is by way of a greeting. Two of our panelists were teachers of mine at the Yale School of Drama. And I just wanted to say that I'm very happy to see them. I welcome them, and I'm honored that they've come to join us for this particular panel. And I also wanted to ask you about that paper, the great...
He's already got the honorarium, so you can't...
I'm now pleased to introduce Roger Copeland. Roger Copeland is professor of theater and dance at Oberlin College. He has written about theater, dance, and film for a wide variety of publications, including the New York Times, Partisan Review, The New Republic, American Theater, The Village Voice, and the Drama Review, I Need Oxygen, and many other periodicals. His film, Camera Obscura, won the Festival Award at the Three Rivers Arts Festival in Pittsburgh in 1985. In 2000, he was the recipient of the Stage Bill Award for Theater Journalism. His books include the widely used anthology, What is Dance? And Merce Cunningham, The Modernizing of Modern Dance. He recently wrote and directed a feature-length film entitled The Unrecovered, a fictional narrative about the conspiratorial thinking in the aftermath of 9/11, which actually showed here at the Philoctetes Center over a year ago. Roger Copeland will moderate this afternoon's panel and introduce our other distinguished panelists. Thank you.
I'm gonna start by taking Frank's advice very publicly, turning off my cell phone. I don't know about you, I'm actually expecting a call from Rudy Giuliani's wife, and you know, if you know Judith like I know Judith, you know she tends to call at very inopportune moments. Yeah, well, all three of them actually. So they've all got my number. So those of you who haven't been in the audience for any earlier events at the Philoctetes Center, you know, you may be wondering what connection, if any, exists between this afternoon's panel and the building in which we're housed, which is actually it's the New York Psychoanalytic Society. Well, it's really easy. Our topic this afternoon is drama and theater criticism as practiced by serious, intelligent adults. And any such person who continues to write about drama or theater in this country at this point in the 21st century clearly needs to have his or her head examined. So, you know, case closed. Also, appearances to the contrary, this afternoon's panel is not being commercially sponsored or subsidized by either Geritol or Centrum Silver. But let me tell you, this is, you know, for the first time ever, I am beginning to suspect maybe I chose the right occupation. I mean, you know I'm never going to produce a body of work like Eric Bentley's or Robert Brustein's or Stanley Kauffmann. But if when I'm in my 80s or 90s, I could just have their body, you know, I'd be pretty happy. So. Anyway, the three panelists sitting around this table are three of the hardiest long-distance runners in the business. And because all three of them have been so tirelessly productive for so many years, the task of introducing them and doing justice to their achievements without using up the whole 2 hours just doing the introduction, it's going to be nearly impossible. One of Eric Bentley's earliest books is called A Century of Hero Worship. And I'm going to have to restrain myself during these intros from succumbing to hero worship, since these three titans of the theater are indeed personal heroes of mine. So it's a very moving experience for me to be able to sit here with them. And despite my very strongly secular leanings, I think it's fair to say that I worship them in an almost religious manner. So here goes. No delusions of adequacy about doing justice to the warp and woof of their careers, but here's my attempt at an introduction. Eric Bentley, to my left, is a playwright, a critic, a scholar, and seems like a gentleman, too. I've just met him, but so all those things. And for those of you who may not be lucky enough to know this, he is also a marvelous cabaret performer, something that seems only fitting for the man who did more than anyone else to introduce the work of Bertolt Brecht to America. Eric was the drama critic for The New Republic from 1952 to 1956. He taught for many years at Columbia. Now, am I right? Is this, you were actually a student at Columbia. Unbelievable. And there's another one back there. Wow. Okay. His plays include Lord Alfred's Lover, which is the best play I know about Oscar Wilde, and Are You Now or Have You Ever Been, about spinelessness during the McCarthy era. His critical works include The Playwright as Thinker, What is Theater, a great book about Bernard Shaw, I think it's just called Bernard Shaw, and The Life of the Drama, which began as the Norton Lectures at Harvard. And Mr. Bentley was inducted into the Theater Hall of Fame in 1997. Robert Brustein, to my right, maybe politically, I'm not sure about, but anyway, no, not really. No, probably no. We can, I thought so at Yale, but okay, but not necessarily now. Anyway, we'll talk about that. He is currently University Senior Research Fellow and former professor of English at Harvard, where he was also the founding artistic director of the ART, the American Repertory Theater. Now, many of us in this room know him best as Dean Brustein, the former dean of the Yale Drama School, who in the mid-1960s almost single-handedly, I think, whipped a place that had fallen into the lethargic decline into a whole new shape and a whole new life. He's been theater critic for the New Republic since 1959, although I fear, technically speaking, that may not still completely be the case, and that's one of the scandals I think that we may want to talk about this afternoon. And the person that I will always know as Dean Brustein is also the author of an immense number of books, 15 books about theater and society. His most recent book, Millennial Stages, was published just last year. A new book, Shakespeare's Prejudices, will see the light of print next year, 2008. He's also written many full-length plays, including Demons, Nobody Dies on Friday, and a delightful new play that I just read a couple of months ago about a certain Will Shakespeare and a certain Kit Marlowe called The English Channel. Stanley Kauffmann has been the film critic for the New Republic since before a lot of people in this room were born. And he's probably best known to a lot of you as one of the few truly major film critics of the second half of the 20th century. Now, this afternoon, even though he's not wearing a hat, he is going to put on, metaphorically, one of his other hats, his theater critic hat, because at various points in his long professional career, Stanley has served as the theater critic for Channel 13 in New York, the New Republic, Saturday Review, and some really obscure publication. I'm not even sure if it's still around, the New York March of Dimes, or New York, something rhymes with dimes, something like that. His latest book is a group of memoirs entitled Albums of a Life, and one of those memoirs is about his 8 months as theater critic for that newspaper of record, something that I'm sure we'll want to get into this afternoon. Before we do that, let's make sure that we are all on the same page, or if not the same page, at least the same book. And that book is, of course, The Playwright as Thinker, the book that provided the title for today's panel, The Playwright as Thinker. I mean, the critic as thinker. Now, I'm not proposing that this afternoon's Gabfest be an examination of the Bentley legacy, pure and simple. But I think it's a very logical place for us to start, because it seems to me that this great book, first published in 1946, is indisputably the great study of post-war drama. And arguably, I think you can really make a claim that it is the greatest book about the drama written in the 20th century. Now, I don't want to put words into Bob's mouth or Stanley's mouth, but I suspect they'd agree with me that it's hard to think of another book that did more to create the climate in which serious American drama and theater might have thrived in the second half of the 20th century, if indeed it did thrive. So let me turn to the youngest, most impressionable member of the panel, that young whippersnapper, Bob Brustein, who studied under Eric at Columbia, and ask him about the significance of Eric's great book coming as it did right after the war. I mean, did the scales sort of fall from your eyes? What sort of impact did it have on you as a
Well, let me begin by saying how privileged and happy I am to be here with these distinguished gentlemen and progenitors of all the things you spoke about, and with many of my older students, Ann Cattaneo, Jeremy McCarter, Bob Marks, Jonathan, I never taught you, Francis Levy, and Roger Copeland. There are others in the room that I haven't identified, but it makes the point that the drama, the theater, and criticism as well is a kind of continuum. That there's a lot of feeding going on, a lot of symbiosis going on, that you can't make a move really without affecting somebody else in this particular field. And you hope that that move is positive rather than negative. And I can certainly attest to the impact that Eric Bentley's playwright as thinker had on me. I had been a student at the Yale School of Drama for a year in 1948. And I was appalled, actually, at the fact that and I found this in Eric's book, testimony to the fact that we would end our experience of watching a play there, and we talk about the acting, we talk about the directing, we talk about the technical work, we talk about the lighting, we talk about the management. We would never, ever talk about the play. And when I got there, we read plays in synopsized forms, and the way we responded to the plays was to say how many characters, how many sets, where it's placed, what the particular period is, but we never, ever talked about the play. And to come upon this book and to read what Eric had to say about the intellectual content of plays, the artistic content of plays, the way that playwrights influenced each other, the various styles and contrary but nevertheless unified approaches to the theater that one found from the 19th century to the present time, really had an untold influence on me, and this man's name became magic to me. And I also just recently thought in preparing for this panel that I would look back over the book, and came across some passages which I hope I haven't lost. I'll just try to paraphrase them. Here they are. In which he speaks of the need for setting up theaters in colleges. The college theater should beware of totally excluding, on principle, anything but the current commodities of Broadway and the hopeful efforts of our friend who has written the play. And he says, he gives 4 different things that he thinks colleges or universities should do. They should attend themselves to the classics, the great classics of the past. They should deal with new plays as much as possible. They should deal with modern classics, and they should deal with the forgotten play. I didn't know I was doing that, but when I went to Yale and I started the Yale Repertory Theater, we really started a theater that was built on the principles that Eric had enunciated in this book. And I've been trying to do it ever since, up until 5 years ago when I retired from running the American Repertory Theater. And there was one other thing he said that I found quite stunning as well, and that had to do with his attack on those who would attack what is now called elitism. He was holding out for a theater that had intelligence, artistry, creativity, and did not, as he said, or as Chekhov so famously said, bring Gogol down to the people, but brought the people up to Gogol. And I never forgot that, and I never will forget it. And it's something that I've tried very much to fight for in his tradition when we do plays and in my own criticism. So I'll stop there with expressing my gratitude to my old teacher, Eric Bentley, who really had a big impact on virtually everything I did.
Stanley, do you want to talk at all about your initial reaction to the book?
I have 2 debts to pay at once. First is to Bob, who gave me a job. He employed me at the Yale School of Drama and made me a teacher, which I'd never thought of. I never thought of doing. Done a lot of other things, lecturing, so I never thought of being a teacher. He made me one, and it's been the blessing of my life. A lot of the people here today are the fruits of that blessing, and I'll never stop being grateful to him for that. I'm not even going into what his intellect is, just that fact. Then there's Mr. Bentley, who is at once, for me, a burning inspiration, absolutely burning inspiration, and also a great humiliator. I took a look through the playwright as thinker preparing for this occasion. Page after page, I saw things that I thought I had said, he had said 30 years earlier.
And you will, Oscar, you will.
I will. Well, I have. Delving further into the works of Bob and Eric, if I may call you by your first name.
We've been colleagues since 1959.
I'll just interrupt to one brief anecdote. I used to be an editor at Knopf, as Ellen, who worked in knows, and my first acquaintance with Bob was I read his theater criticism, Partisan Review and Harper's, and got in touch with him and had lunch with him, trying to get him as an author for Knopf. Declined. He had a job.
My agent declined. I wanted to publish Theater of Revolt with Knopf, and my agent wouldn't let me. They didn't offer enough money.
Just to conclude this opening bit, looking again at Bob's work, looking again at the playwright as thinker, this past week, I realized that this meeting is simply a continuum. Every decade, every year, every month, there's moaning about the condition of the theater, and it's all true. Shaw said once, the theater is always in a low estate. If you look at an anthology of great plays from the Greeks to today, you think, my God, what a panorama of achievement. Then you look at the dates, and you see that hundreds of years elapsed between one play and the next. Sometimes we have the bad luck to be caught between the people. All I'm trying to say seriously is that it's important that these complaints go on, that they be enlightened and progressive complaints. And that's, I hope, what we're going to try to do today.
Right. Eric, do you want to talk at all about the reception of the book? I mean, you must have been vilified in many quarters of the American theater, especially the commercial American theater, which was pretty much all that existed in 1946. Anything you want to say about the way in which the book was received? And
well, it's very advantageous to receive a lot of attacks. You got attention. The worst thing, you know, what Oscar Wilde said about being talked about, not being talked about. The playwright as thinker was a peculiar event for me because I never predicted the way it turned out. I never intended most of the things that happened, both in negative and the positive. I did want, and I continued after that book, to attack what was the establishment in the universities, in drama departments, etc., plus what was the establishment in New York of the more highbrow end of Broadway. You know, the Maxwell Andersons.
Right.
They were the enemy as far as I was concerned. This was in part political. I was at the time a young Englishman and a member of the Independent Labour Party in London, which was a Marxist party opposed, called by the communists Trotskyite, though we didn't regard ourselves as such, very anti-Soviet, but also fundamentally anti-capitalist. And although I perhaps wasn't as open about that as I might have been in the early drama criticism, this was the impetus. The only critic that commented on me at that time that that was wise to what was going on was George D. Nathan. George D. Nathan reviewed The Playwright Thinker. He's attacked in it on one page. He took that in very good part, as you would expect if you knew George D. Nathan. He got in a few nice quips at me. He said, sometimes beneath the academic gown, the stuffed shirt is mildly visible. Well, I didn't mind being called a stuffed shirt vis-a-vis George D. Nathan, but what he found that none of the other critics found was in what became my notorious attack on Eugene O'Neill, if you can call it that. He said, it's the British attitude to American culture that makes... Bentley is the English critic of O'Neill. He's saying what the other English critics have said. It occurred to me at that time that this was probably true, all of it. I was a British subject. The drama criticism I had known as a boy in the 30s was that of James Agate and St. John Irvine in the two Sunday papers in London. And that anti-O'Neill, they were also anti-Clifford Odets, in a way I wasn't because I shared the political radicalism there, that was true. But what they didn't get, and what they didn't get later when I continued, was that there was a social criticism of the middlebrow Broadway. I've always loathed Broadway, not just on Marxist grounds, though there too, but on the grounds of its pretentious middlebrow culture that was there regnant in the Playwrights Company, the Theatre Guild, and so on. That was what I was consciously doing. None of that really came out in the discussion, though I should say that that book, I don't consider it, I hope it's not my best, because I hope one or two of the others are better, but it attracted more attention, too much for my later career, so to speak, if I can think selfishly for the moment. America has no second act. I could have no second act, you see, after that. And when I wrote what I think, things I much more wanted to write and thought was perhaps doing better, there was no attention left because it wasn't as controversial. When I wrote The Playwright Thinker, I was prepared to be outrageous. I wasn't too arrogant, and I wasn't suffering from overconfidence. It wasn't that. It was just that I wanted to be heard, and by God, I was. To my surprise, various people in the establishment came on my side. For instance, the Saturday Review of Literature, which was second only to the New York Times as an upholder of the middlebrow culture in the theater, leapt to my support, and they produced what was probably the most influential review of the time that had the headline, Mr. Bentley swings an axe. Well, I guess I did, but I hadn't been aware of doing anything of the kind. But it was because this kind of violence against the sacred theatre guild, against the gods, despite my attitude to Brecht, I wasn't even pro Kurt Weill, because he was in his Broadway phase. He was also homophobic, which was another point which one also wasn't open about in those days. But it was a very strange situation. I was immediately... You see, I was a provincial little boy in American terms, working for a small college in North Carolina. But when I came to New York for Christmas to see some shows, I saw the opening of a few plays that became famous by Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller later in those days. I was immediately picked up by the people that were reviewing the Playwrights' Thinker. Barrett Clark had a big radio program with all the Broadway stars coming on to talk with me as it happened. And I remember some of the little experiences that may amuse some of you now. Various dignitaries from the Broadway world that I had attacked were invited to come on the program, and some did, but one that refused was Lillian Hellman. And the fact is, she isn't mentioned in the Playwrights' Thinker. I value that to this day.
She was mentioned a lot in your reviews.
I had seen some of her work. I knew she was communistically inclined, therefore on the left, as we thought of it in those days. But I had not had the usual middle-brow approach to her as a writer. In other words, I did not think she was a great truth teller on the stage. She wasn't the answer. She wasn't the Playwrights' Thinker. The other day, I read in the New York Review of Books, this week's issue, that the view of O'Neill expressed in the Playwrights' Thinker is now been found to be invalid by a academic critic who happens to lives on one floor beneath me in my New York apartment house, Jack Diggins. Jack Diggins has discovered that O'Neill was a thinker, and I had said he wasn't. Well, look at that. First of all, I said this during World War II, before O'Neill's best plays were known to the world.
Exactly.
All his best plays came out, were released by him after the war. But anyway, Mr. Diggins, who of course has a friendly relation with me, may not have after this, because Diggins is a thinker, a political scientist, an expert on Max Weber, subjects like that, that he could present O'Neill as an expert on those people, or his thinking along the lines. It's just fantastic. Who knows how to think among playwrights? Well, obviously Bernard Shaw thinks too much, you might say. Couldn't stop that brain thinking and thinking. And there are others, but O'Neill is surely not one of them. I mean, if you take Morning Becomes a Lecture, as a play about American history that's serious about the Civil War, as a historian, it's not serious, it's history. That's just a backdrop for a composer of melodrama. So I don't have to tell Jack Diggins that I later said other things about O'Neill when I'd read better plays by him. What I said initially is true by and large, that O'Neill in the plays that he wrote were really good. He wrote during World War II, but I didn't know. Are plays of feeling about his own family. And the more he came to just the memory of his childhood and who his parents were, the more he could do magnificent writing away from all the books he'd read.
Right.
And all the thinkers he thought about.
And all that pseudo-German expressionist stuff that he was jettisoning too.
Aren't you saying, Eric, that he was better when he wasn't thinking?
Yes, that's right.
And that some playwrights are better when they're not thinking?
I wanted to say something about Bob's kind remarks to me, and that when people are kind enough to refer to successes of mine, I think of the many failures that have weighed me down, maybe more than they should have if I had more real strength. I would like to mention this one because it refers to Bob. When I came to Columbia, I was brought there originally by Jacques Boston in the history department, having in mind that I would replace Joseph Wood Kreutz, a professor of drama, and that I would create, in a new art center Columbia was going to have, a new theater department and a repertory theater. In this, for various reasons not to be mentioned here, I failed. My student, however, went to 2 other universities and did it in both places. So I couldn't feel anything but, shall we say, envy, jealousy. Certainly, they were not ugly passions, but I did wish it was me. Those were the things I had wanted to do, and I didn't do. I did some other things instead, perforce. But that's where, if I had anything to do with Bob doing so, I'll gladly take the credit. But I think of my time at Columbia as having failed in its main purpose. And it must have been partly because of me. I can't blame that on everybody else.
Eric, it wasn't because of you, because I went through the same process at Columbia. There was an effort to create an art school at Columbia, and a man was hired named Davidson Taylor, who was the vice president in charge of programming at CBS. And he was hired to interview a number of us about what should happen at a School of the Arts at Columbia. And naturally, a number of us thought maybe we might be in a position to take over that school and develop it. And I'm sure you were being interviewed in the same way. And I met with him one day, and we spoke for about 3 hours, and I was called back about 6 months later, and I thought, this is interesting. And he called me back and asked me exactly the same questions as if he didn't even know. And they finally did appoint a dean, and the dean was Davidson Taylor.
I remember that.
Yes.
That was after my failures. Right?
That wasn't your failure.
Yeah.
It was doomed to be what it was going to be. And
before I stop there, there's one thing I wanted to say that is not connected with what we're currently talking about. One thing I hadn't absorbed completely when I wrote The Playwrighter's Thinker or any of my early works was the following, that people talk about the drama critics. What the term means when they use it is not clear, because there are 2 quite different enterprises involved.
Drama,
theater.
One is the one that's familiar to the general public because they're involved in it, is that if we're taking Broadway, which was for me the enemy, but is for good Americans the center of things, what the Broadway theater needs is a consumer guide. And that's what the critics should, the so-called critics in quotes, should provide. For instance, the New York Times did provide it in the supplement they had until last year for television programs, for films that were on television. And they'd give you a 1-line statement, which were often quite witty and full of content, which were a good consumer guide. You knew when you read that 1 line, which for a long time was edited by the same journalist, but he's gone now. I forget to have several people doing it. That's if the Broadway theater just needs a consumer guide, or the public wants put it this way, the tickets are very expensive. People think nothing nowadays of $100 for a ticket. The people that can pay it, they think nothing of it. And you know, $500 you can get for the equivalent of the black market, which is no longer black. Before you spend that money, even though you're rich, you want a little guidance as to whether it's going to be well spent. I thought the critics in that area, and I would have been perfectly willing to function in that way at one time in my life, could evaluate the shows, instead of going about academically at A, B, C, and D, as this is $100 show. It's worth $100. This one's worth 75. This one's 25. And this is worth it. And you could become quite skillful. The economic evaluation.
It's putting your mouth where your money is. Yeah, it's absolutely right. It's
guiding the public, and the public has a right. The rich public has a right to get something for its riches, you know, a little guidance. That's all right. And it is a form of criticism, just as when you come out of the movies on Saturday night and grunt, that's a form of criticism. So everybody is a critic in that sense. They all deny they are, but they're not. They come out either overjoyed that it's wonderful, or the opposite, and that's a critical reaction. That's what it's all about. Well, you see, that's one province. But when we highbrows in this room talk about, you know, great critical writing, we're not thinking about that sort of thing at all. We're divorced from that situation in our minds, and we're thinking of brilliant articles that we read in books reprinted by George Bernard Shaw, or by Max Beerbohm, or by Stark Young. We're thinking of excellent writing about the theatrical art. Now, you could say that functionally, that the people in the newspapers are just doing the first sort of thing, the consumer guide, or should be, and the people in the weeklies, monthlies, etc., are free to do the best they can as critics of an art. People are writing skillfully about the art as art, not as sociology or anything else, the way they do in the graduate schools, but as the art of the art. And you become good at it. And the theatrical criticism has one difference from the literary, in that the theatrical critic becomes knowing and sensitive to different degrees of merit in performance. For instance, your ordinary newspaper commentator doesn't know the difference between a star and a great actor. But the critic, the real critic, does. Or the average critic doesn't know, so-called, doesn't know the difference between a good performance and a great performance, an adequate performance and a superb performance. These gradations call for the discrimination that if you're someone that's into the theater art, like Shaw when he wrote about it, would be able to give you, why so-and-so's performer is a better actress than so-and-so. Then you're into real artistic criticism on the same level as literary criticism that doesn't deal with the theater. That's what I wanted to mention as appearing here. That's what I didn't find anything in the Playwrights' Thinker, I don't think, about this. Right. Because I hadn't yet done theater criticism. I got into the world where it was. I had just attacked Broadway, which is a good thing to do, in a book published by Reynolds and Hitchcock, and later for a magazine that I worked for, it was like the New Republic, which, whatever its ups and downs politically, has always been rather high in its standards in criticism of the performing arts and of the literary arts. That's where you have to go. And I've always, in my American career, that is after my English beginnings, been attached to these two enemy weekly publications, the New Republic and The Nation, with all their ups and downs and strange faults. It was precious to someone like me that they were there.
Speaking of the kind of adversarial criticism that we're describing and that the three of you practice, it seems to me there's another variation on it that Bob has been a principal pioneer of, and that is, what do you do as somebody writing about the theater on a regular basis when the vast majority of what you see fails miserably, and you then decide you're going to focus on the cultural malaise that underlies that failure? And I don't know if you want to talk about that option, you know, maybe simply as a means of maintaining your sanity as a theater critic, but I mean, but it's something that seems to be starting with Seasons of Discontent, with those pieces that are collected in that book. You were very, very conscious oftentimes to use the theater as a barometer of larger cultural problems, paradoxes, shortcomings.
I want to make 2 points about that, and thank you for bringing that up. I did try to do that. It was very boring to be continually banging your head against what you thought to be the really deleterious and second-rate mediocrity of the Broadway stage. And you gain nothing. You're probably losing readers, because after a while, it really gets to be boring to read such a thing. So if I wasn't able to put it in a context and try to see how this play fit into our particular time, our particular society, our particular culture, our particular political life, and how it reflected on that. And I don't think anyone can write a word without somehow creating that kind of reflection. You just have to find it.
Right.
Then I began to get happier about my criticism. And more, I found myself subordinating the judgment that was so necessary to criticism, and that we always, you know, we're all looking for that judgment. Does he like it? Doesn't he like it? Does she like it? Doesn't she like it? And I found that to be, when I read criticism, the least interesting part of the criticism. And I began to call that Himalaya criticism after Danny Kaye, when he was asked whether he liked the Himalayas, he said, loved him, hated her. And I thought, this is essentially what we've all been practicing, you know, Himalaya criticism. And especially when I began practicing as a director, as an artistic director, as an actor, as a playwright, I knew that kind of criticism did me no good whatsoever when it was leveled at me from somewhere else. And I was trying really to find what it was that was helpful and useful, without in any way deferring or cheating or cheapening or lying. And I wanted to see what it was that could possibly help a theater artist to advance. And so I thought my most important function as a critic was to try and find out what these artists, if they were artists, were trying to do, and then to see whether they did that successfully. But at least try and find out what the intention was before I rejected it.
Stanley?
Context. You touched a poignant note when you talked about the playwright as thinker and your animus against the middle-brow theater. Oh, if only we had that middle-brow theater back now. Where is a theater guild?
Yeah.
Where is Maxwell Anderson, Philip Barry, Robert Sherwood, when we need them? We have no consolidated enemy now. We have no consolidated cultural being on Broadway now. I don't go to the theater much anymore, but I read. I'm not talking about musicals. I don't know anything about them or what's happening. And I don't think you're talking about musicals, although you wrote excellent pieces on My Fair Lady. And he said about My Fair Lady, this is an interpolation, he said about My Fair Lady, Bernard Shaw went back to the legend to make this play, a brilliant comedy of his, and the makers of My Fair Lady took it back to the legend. As far as I can make out from reading about the Broadway theater today, there is no firmly entrenched middle-class play that's going on. There is no sense that the middle brow as such is a power in the theater. The theater seems to me, the Broadway, I'm not going to leave musicals out because that's a whole other area. It seems to me to once in a while squeeze in an attempt at a play production, Broadway. And what this is, when I say that I wish all those dull people were back, or nice dull people were back, it's that I'm so adrift, so bewildered, so lost in the current cultural situation. When we talk about reforming this or that in the theater or anything else, I don't know what we're reforming it toward. In the century, the decades, it seems like centuries, that I've been through, for the most of those decades, there was always, at least I believed there was, a structure which I could like and loathe. And I have no sense of that now. I have only a sense of continual flow and whirl and change and rampant hedonism. And that seems to me to apply to the Broadway theater too. If you were going to write the playwrights thinker today, I don't think you would, because there isn't.
Well, I might if I was in London, and I would attack David Hare as the Maxwell Anderson.
There's no David Hare in this country. David Mamet is not David Hare.
No, I wouldn't attack David Mamet.
No, what I'm saying is we have no David Hare in this country. We have Mamet, we have...
Mamet's written a book against Hollywood, which is the same thing as Broadway.
Adam Rapp, we have Paula Vogel, we have about 35 really fine playwrights. Sam Shepard, yes.
Those are, whatever you think of them, they're not middle brows by any means. And we have or Wallace Shawn, certainly not a middle brow. But those aren't controlling, they aren't controlling forces in our theater. They don't dictate to the Schuberts the way the Playwrights Company used to. You remember that producing organization?
Yes.
And my concern with the topic of this panel today is where is the theater going to come from? What's it going to be for people who have ambitions towards theater criticism today? Drama criticism, they can always say, oh, we're going to write another book on some giant of the past. But what would Joe or Jane Blow do, think, yearn for, ache for in the future? For me, that's one of the distinguishing marks of criticism, of good criticism. Anyone can write a theater review. Any literate, intelligent person can tell you on paper what he or she thought of a play.
As opposed to poetry or dance. Or,
yes, exactly. As opposed to, yes, exactly. Because it's the same currency. But what distinguishes the good, valuable theater critic, in my view, is that in that review, or certainly in the current of his reviews, you sense that he's writing about a cause, about a theater in his or her mind. That the criticism he's writing is possibly in some ways cloaked, but as a crusade. I mean, Bernard Shaw, if I may tell you things that Bernard Shaw said, said that he'd been crusading in his criticism for years and years for a new drama. Then he found out there wasn't any, he had to write it. But he was crusading. And you wrote the playwrights think, of course, a theater in your heart, in your head, that you wanted to see come into being. The same is certainly true for you. And you made theaters to help fulfill it. You did the Bernard Shaw thing. You tried to make the theater to fulfill the one you were aching for in your criticism. And I don't know, I can't imagine, this is just not my boast, my defect. I can't imagine easily the theater that would underlie the new critics.
I have an idea, it just occurred to me, which is that Eric and Stanley and perhaps myself were too successful in establishing the importance of the playwright as thinker, or a thinking playwright, or a truly artistic and we created places for them which are no longer being supported. And therefore they are no longer being supported. It's not that there are no playwrights in this country. I think there are more playwrights in this country of high quality than ever before in my memory. They just don't have a place to have their plays produced. Broadway has just turned away from them altogether, and the little theaters, as you call them, and even the resident theaters, the resident theater movement, which is no longer being supported either by the National Endowment for the Arts or by the Ford Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation or any foundation except for Mellon and Schubert and Hugh Jamson. A few foundations are supporting these theaters, but not enough to keep them going, and therefore they have begun to turn themselves into commercial producing organisms. And they are putting on things that have been successful elsewhere, and they're not taking the chances on the new. And as a result, we have succeeded ourselves out of existence, I think.
And isn't there also an incredibly impoverishing pressure on the young playwright who wants to see his or her work produced when he or she is told, look, 2 or 3 characters max, 1 set? I mean, what kind of constricting effect does that have on the dramatic imagination of somebody who wants to think epically, who wants to think about class?
And if that playwright does produce that play, he or she is told, we'll give you a reading, we'll give you a workshop, we'll give you another reading, we'll give you another workshop. They never get productions. Richard Nelson wrote a very inflammatory speech about this recently, in which he complained the playwright is always being helped to write his play, but by dramaturgs, by directors, by artistic directors, but he is never, or she is never allowed to put the play on. And that is a problem.
Returning to what Stanley was saying about the situation, and the young people, some of you are very young here, who might be thinking about becoming drama critics, I think the advice is don't. But if you're interested in theater, which I assume is the underlying thought, do something else, not drama criticism. It's something not to do for various reasons, and Stanley gave some of them right now. And it really could, if you think you could do that, then 10 to 1 you could think you can do something else in the theater, in one branch or another. And like my 2 colleagues here, I think the important branch is the playwright. I think that the center is the playwright for dramatic theater. That's not true for ballet, obviously, and circus, but it's true for the dramatic theater. So you should just try to become a playwright, and I agree with what Bob said, that there are plenty of playwrights, even quite good playwrights, more than in the past as we've known it in New York in the 60 years I've been here, undoubtedly. That's why the relatively established figures now, like Mamet, I wouldn't attack, because he's not the enemy. He's not part of the system that's the enemy. He has to work with the system, but he hates it and writes a book against it, so he doesn't need me to write a book against it. I don't know that the situation is really worse than in the 30s, though. I think what you said in the beginning, Stanley, was that the theater is always in an impossible state.
But in the 30s, the theater was, as usual, in a low state, but it was a recognizable low state. It was middle brow at its best. It was Marxist and so on and so forth, all these things. You know, there was a landscape that you could perceive. I, speaking just for myself, cannot perceive that now. And although I understand you once advised that in your foreword to the Playwright as Thinker that critics should be abolished.
Yes.
That makes me nervous, not for quite a personal reason, because I don't have that much longer to contradict it. But something has happened in the, what is it now, 3 centuries since criticism, theater criticism began in the English language, is that stealthily almost a new literary genre grew. There is great writing in the history of theater criticism. It is a literature, a corollary art. And if one wants to take that tack, it is possible to, as part of the worry about the future of the theater, to worry that that literary genre is imperiled. I mean, who would want to be cheated of the critics, or of you too, speaking for myself, just in reading? In reading, you said yourself just now when you were talking about your own criticism that you were interested in more than the Himalayas.
Right, yeah.
And what you were interested in was enrichment, and that vehicle of enrichment, that vessel and opportunity for it, exists in theater criticism, not exclusively.
You know, and if you make a list of the intellectuals who were interested in writing about the theater a generation ago, I mean, Wilfrid Sheed, Susan Sontag, Elizabeth
Richard
Hardwick,
Gilman.
I mean, Gilman, of course, who we lost just last. So that's something different today, isn't it? That we don't have people of that caliber who even go to the theater, let alone want to write about it.
But we never had theater of that caliber. I don't think the situation is any worse than in the past, and in some ways it's better. As Bob is saying, there are actually plenty of good writers around. The arrival of women writers as a new force is interesting culturally and positive.
Right.
What's different, Eric, is the audience. We haven't discussed the audience.
That's what I mean.
Who recognize, when you go to the theater on Broadway, for example, or even off Broadway, do you recognize the audience anymore?
No.
I used to recognize my aunt in her mink coat going to the matinee, you know. There was an audience there that was regular, passionate, whether their taste was any good or not. They went to the theater. I don't see that audience anymore.
Well, excuse me.
I'm sorry. Well, I was just going to say that it's mostly tourists and expense account people. And as a result, look at the audience, say, for the New Republic. We've been mentioning the New Republic. We all wrote or write for it. And that was the place where, you know, the history of theater criticism had a very noble history, starting with Stark Young and then yourself and Stanley, who wrote theater criticism for it. The fact is, the New Republic has virtually done away with its theater criticism because, for political reasons.
And Time and Newsweek have also.
Time and Newsweek also. But I think in New Republic it's been political reasons because the readership has kind of moved to the right, and it's not a theater-going readership.
Yeah.
It's a neocon. Right. It's not neocon, but it's more politically organized than it is culturally organized.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's a serious change. You know.
There, sitting next to you, is a first-class theater critic.
Indeed.
Who lost his job.
That's another one.
Because the paper he was writing for ceased to be interested in the theater. They didn't fire him, they fired the theater.
But he started his own.
He started his own, which you and I have appeared in.
Terrific.
Who is he?
What you say?
Jonathan Kalb. Jonathan Kalb. What's the name of your web center again? It's Hot Review. HotReview.org.
When in the late 1920s, early 1930s, my parents, who were just middle-class people, I liked them, but they were just middle-class. Well, I liked one of them. Went to the theater every few weeks. And after they went to the theater, whatever it was, all week long after that, at dinner elsewhere, my father would say, she should have shot him before he made the phone call. And my mother would say, no, she was right to shoot him. That's the correlation to what you were saying.
Yeah.
There was an audience. The level is not, but it wasn't a recognizable audience. That's part, I think, of what I'm complaining about. I don't recognize the world anymore. Maybe that's because I'm an antique. Very possibly because.
And the weird thing is, even downtown, I don't recognize the audience. Whether it's a public theater, you know, whether it's PS 122, there isn't a sense that it's a community that really, really believes in a set of values that are being nurtured by that institution.
You mentioned a name now that's one key to what I think all consider the public theater. We all had our troubles with Joe Papp as critics and otherwise. But Papp's, whatever it was, 25 years or so, running the public theater, that was a vital force in New York, dynamic. At least sometimes gave you something to be furious about, and sometimes things to be wild about. But Papp made that theater because he had a clear view of the culture he was in and was making his theater for.
Right.
Whether you agreed with it or not, in his head it was crystal clear. And that's what produced that theater. And that's what I feel the loss of now.
Well, you see, Stanley, an aspect of that is Papp was a former communist and leftist and Marxist.
Yeah.
And he believes, as I do, in state theater. That's also a monarchist, going back to France in the 17th century, and not in the capitalistic theater, not in the theater business.
Yeah.
No business like show business, except show business is exactly like every other business because it is part of that.
But Papp got into the theater business with Chorus Line and with Pirates of Penzance and a number of things. But he used them to finance his work at the New York Public. And the question was, what point was he more interested in the financing than he was in what he was financing? There was always a delicate balance with
But he began for legitimate reasons.
Absolutely.
Began.
Oh, the most legitimate reasons.
You know, and I would
He's a hero of our
say-
culture, Joe Papp.
Yes.
No matter how middlebrow Papp's own taste was, he was constantly able to transcend that and support experimental artists like Richard Foreman and Lee Brewer. And we don't have anybody with that Catholicity of vision.
Oscar Eustis is doing that now. Oscar Eustis is playing host right now to the Worcester
That's
Group,
true.
to Labyrinth Theater, which is really taking.
He was an old-fashioned socialist. Like his belief that theater in Shakespeare in the Park should be free.
Right.
See, it's not necessarily a reasonable thing because the kind of public he got they paid $10 to see a movie. They could pay $10 to see Shakespeare. But it was important that Papp thought that way, as against Moses, who represented the capitalistic system against him.
Absolutely. And
It
he
was his
heroic.
idea to make the theater a part of the world you lived in. How many people do you know who are not themselves working in or specifically interested, who go to plays? How long is it since you went to a dinner party where you met intelligent, literate human beings who talked about a play?
On the other hand, remember the days when Lionel Trilling would tell us that, you know, the theater was not a legitimate form of literature.
He said the same thing about film.
Exactly. And a lot of intellectuals thought it was beneath the salt, and Eric was one of the few intellectuals in those days who was passionate about the theater, and he brought a lot of intellectuals along with him. But you were the first, really, to take the theater seriously in that age.
Frank, there's so much talent in the audience. At what point should we, I see Rocco, I see Jonathan, I see, all these people who are probably going to have interesting
That was
questions
true,
to ask.
in left-wing journalism of that period. I'm talking about the 1940s now. There were Mary McCarthy, for instance, tried occasionally, but she was so untheatrical a person. One of her judgments was the importance of being earnest is not funny. And the most funny, one of the funniest characters in all dramatic literature in that play was not funny, the lady. And
Streetcar Named Desire was a mother-in-law play.
And King Lear is about ungrateful children. And,
Well, that's the Yiddish version.
That's right.
They never come to see
But Orson Welles said once that anyone who talks about films and doesn't mention money is a jackass. We can say, I think, that anyone who talks about the theater and doesn't mention money is equally jackassian.
It's an opening.
You were saying about the $100 a ticket thing. And you were talking about the change in the audience. Who can afford it? My parents couldn't have gone to the theater if it were the equivalent for their day
Yes.
of what it costs today. And you're also talking about these playwrights who live from reading to workshop to reading to workshop. It costs money to do a play. It costs to do an off-Broadway play. It costs someone substantial money. When people tell me, as they often do, about the really dreadful things they've seen off-Broadway in some attic somewhere, it costs $30 to do it. Why did anyone think this was worth $30? Dollars. And so when you get to the $3 million productions on Broadway, who can possibly pay back that $3 million that the show cost? The tourists.
Roger, maybe Jonathan Kauffmann is someone who's another generation.
Yeah.
Before we get to the general audience.
Absolutely. Terrific, if we want. I mean, I'd love to hear if Rocco has a couple of cents he wants to put in, or a couple of millions he wants to put in.
Former critic, mind you.
Yeah, that's right.
But you see,
Pose a question.
Rocco, you know what I found on my bookshelf? Remember that issue of Yale Theater that you edited devoted to American theater criticism, and these three guys were writing for it then?
what you're saying, Stanley, is the economic theory interpretation of history is just as applicable to the theater as to everything else. In fact, slightly more so.
Much more naked.
The dollar. You follow the dollar and you get the answer.
Jonathan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if there's something you'd really like to say, I think we'd probably like to hear it.
Thank you.
You want to stand up? This is a working mic. Can you just stand up? Because you're not mic'd in, and the people downstairs won't hear. It's there. There's a little mic right on you. If you just stand up and come around. Or pull it over.
And this is Jonathan Kalb, everyone, who is really one of the few legatees still writing. I would say Jonathan and Michael Feingold, who said
Another boss of mine, someone else who gave me a job.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak. I did not come prepared to speak, so let me see what I can pull out of my brain here. I recognize everything that's been said by these three heroes of mine as true. However, I can't see it the same way because I'm about half the age of my beloved former teacher, Stanley Kauffmann, here. I am discouraged and dismayed by the situation you describe, but I can't say I'm confused by it. I think that maybe that's because I grew up with some of the changes that everyone has mentioned. I think that what needs to be said is that the disappearance of space that's available to serious criticism is a big issue here. It's not just Bob and the New Republic. Downstairs is John Halpern, who should be up here, who has just recently told me about the cuts to his column in The Observer. We could list on and on and on the disappearances that have happened, apart from my column in New York Press. One does what one can with a changing world, and it's absolutely senseless to simply complain about it and shoot arrows and missiles at this changing world. I think our job is to look at the disappearance of critical culture and find ways and places to continue it. Part of what's happening today, in my view, is that there's no social capital to be had in either knowing about the current theater the way there was a generation ago, or writing about the current theater as there was a generation ago. The editors who are cutting these theater columns are right from their point of view, because they're looking at a world in which theater doesn't matter to their readership. For us who love the theater, to say, "Oh, you Philistines," it's terrible. You know, it's like getting mad at the Bushies for having elected a professional Philistine. Right. They elected him. They got 50 million people to vote for him. That's the country we live in. What are we going to do about it? And what are we going to do about this problem of the disappearance of critical culture? You have to find ways to be sneaky, to be clever, and to find little avenues to continue it. I think that the world is kind of mixing up right now and trying to figure out what the place for judgment and discrimination is in this new mediated, wired, info age world. We all, I think, and I've spent time being depressed about this everyone's a critic ethos on the internet. And everyone is a critic, but on the other hand, there's a couple of really good bloggers out there. So why take aim at all blogging? Someone said to me the other day, hey, I saw the Hot Review. What an idea, an edited blog. And I thought, wow, is that what I'm doing? I thought it was called a journal. An edited blog used to be called a journal, where you're interested in the quality of the writing and you edit the writing carefully. That used to be called, a journal. So maybe there are places for us to meet, in the future when all of this equalization sends up all of its dust. Everybody gets a chance to express the fact that they're a critic and then becomes hungry again for the views of people who know a little bit more about the subject. So, I don't know. Yes, I'm dismayed, I'm discouraged, but I also am in my 40s and have to look, hopefully, to a long life of figuring out what to do about this, and I'm not giving up, regardless of what Eric says.
Rocco Landesman of the...
You want to go to the mic here, Mark? Well, we can't hear, the people downstairs can't hear you, that's the problem. They hear you with the mic.
People downstairs, the producer of the producers is about to talk.
I'm not going to defend myself against Stanley's charges, at least not this early in the program. I thought a lot of what he said was absolute nonsense. Given the quality and variety of the playwrights that are working and being regularly produced on Broadway at this moment, but that's not what I'm going to take up here. Later, maybe. One of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to this discussion is that when I was in Bob Brustein's program at Yale, it was a program to train critics, because Bob felt that critics needed some training, that publications shouldn't just move someone over from restaurant criticism to theater criticism, and maybe he can address later whether he thinks that program was successful or not. There are not too many of his trained critics out working at the moment, and for various reasons. But when I came through that program, it was very clear, and one of the things we were studying was this thing that we referred to as adversarial criticism. And it was based on a notion that there was a culture and there was a counterculture. It seems to me that now we talk about the lack of the adversarial critics, but we don't mention that there seems to be no longer really a culture and a counterculture. It's much more confusing. It's much more, Roger, as I'm sure you know, it's a much more of an amorphous kind of situation. And one of the things that happened, and it began to happen when Stanley was appointed to be drama critic of the New York Times, is that the mainstream press, the mainstream media, is a lot different than it was in those days when you had a culture and a counterculture. If you look at the people writing in many of the mainstream publications in recent years, Frank Rich, obviously in the New York Times, Ben Brantley and Charles Isherwood in the New York Times, Jeremy M. Carter, who's here now in New York Magazine, and his predecessor, John Simon, a much more sophisticated and educated critic in the mainstream media. So I wonder whether, and I'd like to address this to those of you here, whether there's the same need for the countercultural critics, for the adversarial critics that there was in those days. Many of them, frankly, have moved over to the mainstream media.
Yeah.
Well, I yield to no one in my admiration for Frank Rich's op-ed page on the New York Times, which I think is doing. It's the one consistent onslaught that we've got against this incredible, appalling president that we have to deal with every day. Thank heaven for Frank Rich in that regard. But as a critic, he was a triumphant, witty, powerful middlebrow. And he prevented a lot of very important playwrights and directors from being produced in New York. And I date, the downfall and deterioration of the American theater from Frank Rich's quite brilliant regime, because he wanted those people on stage that he approved of, and he didn't want them if he didn't approve of them.
Like any critic.
Well, I don't think it's the critic's position. Certainly, it's not the position of one newspaper to be determining.
About August Wilson,
but I wasn't suggesting that August Wilson not appear on the American stage. I was a minor, small voice saying that I thought he was essentially a middle-brow writer, regardless of the fact that he was black. He was writing what I thought to be bad Arthur Miller plays, under the influence of a director that he finally was able to throw off and get back to his poetic roots. He was a poet who was not being allowed to perform like a poet. So I was doing the same thing that Hilton Ells has now done in The New Yorker, and he's a black critic, which is to point out that this is an overrated writer. But I didn't want him banished from the New York stage, and I wasn't, thank God, in a position to banish him from the New York stage. And that, by the way, is why I turned down the offer of a job at the New York Times when I had that in 1965. I did not want to be in a position of preventing people from being employed because I had an opinion. But that is what happened with Frank Rich. And I think we can really trace the history of a kind of deterioration in American theater and the quality of American theater and the aspiration and ambitiousness of American theater to that regime, and Ben Brantley is very much in his footsteps.
By the way, when after Bob turned down that job at the Times people were talking to me, and they told me that when Bob was offered the job, he said it ought to be abolished.
And I recommended Stanley, who has never forgiven me for it.
One word to what you said, Rocco. It isn't necessary that all the critics, media critics, let's call them mainstream, big media critics, be bad or stupid. And certainly we have one with us tonight who certainly is not, we're glad is writing criticism. That's not a necessity. What's needed is other critics who have more space, more time, more room for contextual criticism. In other words, more rereadable criticism.
Yes, I agree. The only thing is, it seems to me there was a noticeable change in the quality of criticism in the mainstream press. I mean, we don't know we don't have to mention their names. They're writing for the Daily News, and the New York Post, and the New York Times, and there was a sea change, from my perspective, in the quality of criticism in the mainstream press.
It's inarguable that the literacy and the education of current media critics
I don't think
is
any of
far
them are
above
better
what
than
it
Brooks
used to be.
Atkinson, for instance.
There's a question for Mr. Bentley and others. It's noticeable that you mentioned Brecht and Shaw, who were Marxists to a certain degree. Certainly Brecht was, and Shaw wanted to change the world too. Do you feel that possibly the temporary, maybe, loss of by Marxism has caused the validity and the quality of criticism to go down so much? And the people you mentioned were all people who had the socialist leaning and that type of leaning and had a class outlook, whereas now the class outlook is masked as if it doesn't exist, and this has affected the critics who, for the most part, it seems to me, are not too knowledgeable about class situations and don't protest, except in a very liberal type of way, which makes it inferior.
I don't know how to respond to that, but I was thinking during the discussion that Rocco, I couldn't see it your way that there's been an improvement or a greater sophistication. I think not at all. If you take Time and Newsweek, who now have nothing, they had very sophisticated critics like Louis Kronenberger, for instance.
Jack Kroll.
And Ted Kalem. That's the weeklies, and so we talk about New York Magazine the same. John Simon was the most highbrow of the highbrows on principle. You can't. Nothing has got more sophisticated, but where it was pretty low under Frank Rich, it's even lower now when you find that the critic of the New York Times thinks that My Fair Lady is an improvement on Pygmalion. There is someone that doesn't know the drama, doesn't know the theater, and doesn't know art.
Well, there's no use animadverting against the current critics of big publications. Our real concern, I think, here is what's the future? Is there a future for those who will never be critics of mass circulation journals? What's the future for the intellectual critic, whoever ABC are on the Times, on the radio, and television? They'll always be, they have to be, by the rules of the game, at a lower level than the best minds available. The Times doesn't want best minds on it. Long before if I am one such, I had a predecessor, Stark Young, was hired away from the New Republic to the Times and lasted 1 year. I didn't even equal that.
But
they think they would like. They think at their dinner parties they talk about having good critics, but they get nervous when they're around. Yes, Eric.
What did you mean by lasted 1 year? That's a statement of fact. But he wasn't fired.
He wasn't fired?
No.
I thought he was.
No, from what he used
I don't know the
talk
fact.
about.
Did he resign?
It's very interesting in relation to what we're all talking about. We're now in 1923.
Yes.
And Stark Young was a young instructor at Amherst College who came to New York and was ambitious to go into the theater. He was a playwright and ambitious to be chiefly that. Turned out to be a successful novelist, but got a job from the New Republic, which then could pay real salaries, not like what we got. I got $100, $200 a month.
Oh, I'm going to tell them that.
He found that he didn't feel welcome on the Times, and he was given to understand that he didn't represent the Times readership. He had special taste. That meant partly that he was gay, which he was, but it meant that he was rather an aesthete and an exquisite, which he also was. But he would find exquisite things in actors and actresses even more that the other critics hadn't found. There was real insight and made his writing unique, and what he would find, the spiritual quality in an actress's work. And he'd be able to describe it. But he found that the Times didn't seem, they wanted somebody who spoke for their audience. And of course they got someone, and that was Brooks Atkinson, who was the most important, historically speaking, theater critic of the 20th century. And that under his reign, things changed in the whole system. That it has never been the case since, before, and still isn't the case in other countries like England, that the critics have such decisive influence. It was this one man at this one time, Brooks Atkinson, who in the 20s and 30s, and he went into the 40s, I believe.
Longer.
Established, not through his own power madness or anything, but for the relation he had with the public. Brooks could, he'd make a success, like he decided to say about the new Tennessee Williams or Arthur Miller, tonight the theater became an art again. Last line one. Then he tells the plot, then at the end he said, the theater is an art again. 10 o'clock the morning following, there's a line outside the theater. They both, the play is a hit. No other critic has ever achieved that. Why was it? Not because of anything arrogant or brutal. He was a very mild-mannered gentleman, Brooks Atkinson. And as he said about himself when they made the theater, I tried to be on the level. He was on the level. But the public agreed with him. If he said, I like a play, or I regard this play as art, they knew they were going to regard it as art and like it. That was why, and that was what Stark Young felt he didn't have, because no one had had it to the extent that Brooks did.
Well, if I understand what you're saying, then it didn't really matter at that point in time that Atkinson was writing for the Times. I mean, the power was with the man and not the newspaper.
What I remember, Roger,
one more point. This wasn't a matter of speaking for the New York Times. He was much more liberal, for instance, in politics. He was an ardent New Dealer. The Times was editorial conservative in those days. So it wasn't that kind of politics. It was somehow that he was the kind of person, well-educated, dry, not too intellectual, very much on the level, extremely liberal, big supporter of Roosevelt, the New Deal, the Federal Theater, and so on. And so that was where the then Broadway public was. They were all Brooks Atkinson's children.
Eric, I don't mean to disagree with you, but
that was very unfortunate for the history of the theater. But it wasn't his fault. It was the fault of us, the public. You know, it was that this became a factor. It still isn't true in England. It's never happened yet.
Eric, he was primus inter pares, but you could not have a hit on Broadway without having the 7 newspapers.
Right.
There were 7 newspapers, and they all had to agree in order for there to be a hit. He was the most important. But it wasn't like later when all the other newspapers disintegrated and disappeared.
Oh, no, no.
And to answer your question, Rocco, you were asking about this criticism program that we started at Yale. When I first went to Yale in '66, we felt there was an absence, which was trained critics, intelligent critics, people who knew the field of dramatic literature and could make, and beyond the field of dramatic literature, knew the field of politics and the world and what have you, and had a context. And we started this program, and Stanley came in to teach in it, and Richard Gilman came in to teach in it, had a wonderful faculty. We learned after a period of time, and you know, Roger was in it, Rocco was in it, who else was in it? Frank Levy was in it, of course, and Frank Levy went to the Village Voice. But he was Bill Carol and Seeley, that's right. We had absolutely very distinguished people in it, but they couldn't find jobs, most of them. Frank found a job on the.
I wrote for the Voice.
You wrote for the Voice for a while. Barbara Mackey went out to.
She worked for the Saturday Review.
Saturday Review, and then she went out to the Midwest.
Denver.
Michael Feingold was probably the most successful in that regard. But ultimately, we found we could not place these people. They were too intelligent for the readership. That was the mistake. And so we turned it into a dramaturgy program. I know you hate dramaturgy, but we had internal critics instead of external critics. We were able to place dramaturgs, and they functioned very well. So that was.
I have to say, we're still there.
Oh, Gordon! And Gordon was of course associate dean and also taught in the criticism program.
Yeah.
Gordon Rogoff.
Oh wow!
We're still doing Jonathan knows. We're still doing the criticism.
You're still teaching criticism?
Yes.
Making.
And we have at least one recent graduate, Charlie.
You want to come up to the microphone?
Charles.
Gordon Rogoff is a brilliant critic in his own right, also of the Village Voice and any number of other places.
Just for the record, amongst the still, I'm Gordon Rogoff, and some of you might remember me from writing for the Village Voice over about a 15-year period, and other reasons. One of the students, not that recent, but from the 90s, Charlie McNulty, is now the drama critic of the Los Angeles Times. And he also graduated, if you can call it that, from the Village Voice to the Los Angeles Times. And there are others from the program who are actually getting jobs, or at least trying to write for Jonathan.
Good. Glad to hear that.
I'm glad you mentioned the name of Michael Feingold, because for me, he is one of the most admirable theater critics writing today. He spent 35 years on the level like Brustein, but a very different level, and always conveying a sense of admiration for, respect for his profession.
And I should add that Michael Feingold sent me an email late last night apologizing for not being able to be here and telling me to give his best to his 3 fathers.
We have another question.
Right.
What I hear...
Who are you?
Michael Sachs. I'm a retired attorney, and I'm a longtime attendee of the Philocrates for as long as it's existed. But what I hear really is a great sense of yearning from each of you. A sense of yearning which really seemingly started out at the beginning of your careers, and what you're yearning for is that both criticism and the theater be done at a higher level, a higher intellectual level. And it seemed to be something that you've been struggling for throughout these years. But my question is, and it really goes back to the point made about the audience and the context in which all this takes place. Is there something in American values and the American system, the American cultural context, which is so heavily based on capitalism, which really begins to put the kind of approach you would like to see taken at an inevitable distance? I mean, going back to what Eric Bentley was saying about, the thoughts about a state theater you mentioned, and the impact of capitalism. So do you believe that these American values affects even the more intelligent among us in a certain way in terms of our values and outlook, so that inevitably you don't find a kind of bent of mind that would lead to the opening up that you're really looking for?
Or just a not-for-profit space, a space that's immune to the demands of capital. And that's what we're losing.
Let me just, before this gentleman speaks, in the notes at the end of The Playwright as Thinker, one of your notes is the list of books that I think it's Francis Saussé had about the fate of the theater. He had pamphlets for every decade of his life mourning the end of the theater and the impossibility of us ever getting any better. I don't think I could argue with your views of things, but I think that's just the current trouble with the theater. There's always been a trouble or troubles with the theater. What you said seems to me true, but it's not the theater has suddenly reached a point of trouble.
If I can say something, there's something missing, which is an alternative social and political theory. With the death of Marxism, with the death of the Soviet Union, and all, thank heaven, they died. We don't have that alternative theory against which to push our version of capitalism. As a result, we're involved in a kind of galloping greed, a galloping kind of cumulative situation that I've never experienced in my life before. As you can see with all the corruption in Iraq and the corruption here and the corruption in the current government, this is all, I think, as a result of there's nothing pushing back against it.
It's by John Kenneth Galbraith called countervailing forces. We don't have them anymore.
And that certainly is affecting the theater.
Yes, hi. My name is Randy Jenner. I'm the senior editor of American Theater Magazine. I am a trained critic. I brought my O'Neill Playwrights Conference cap from when I was Mr. Bentley is a friend of mine. I just wanted to, from a long time. And when I first knew Mr. Bentley, I came up to him because of the books, and I got to meet him. But when I met him, he was really a playwright. The person that I met was a playwright. there was this life as a critic, almost a parallel life, a multidimensional. He was a very multidimensional personality for me. I have also, since I work at American Theater Magazine, I go to conferences that TCG does, in which I meet playwrights, and of course, having been to the O'Neill, I've encountered new play developments for playwrights. So it seems to me that to be a young person and to be a writer is really rather a more important commodity at the moment for anybody who is intelligent and smart and has a view in the world. And on the other hand, the heroes who I've met are people who have practiced criticism and then moved on to playwriting. When I got attracted to criticism, it was because of this idea that as a critic, like Pauline Kael, you could be an artist. Is it better for a young critic now is that a more hopeful alternative to pursue playwriting? Why waste your time doing criticism when you can be a playwright at the moment? The playwriting is a very healthy and wonderful place at the moment. There is a nonprofit system that supports them despite the dysfunctionalities of the system with development hell and lack of producing. The other day I got an email from an organization that says, "Oh, let's invite critics to be playwrights." And I'm just trying to understand the legacy of this, that I have understood, my understanding that the heroes that I have moved on to playwriting, adapting plays, translating, versus spending your life as a critic and being a kind of pure soul.
I think it is possible to say flatly that there is no critic in the history of criticism, no first-rate critic even, who would not rather have been a first-rate artist. It's ridiculous to say, I remember Kenneth Tynan, otherwise brilliant, said a remark once about, I didn't write plays, I wanted to be a critic. I don't sing at the Met because I'd rather be a critic.
But I'd rather be Kenneth Tynan than be Maxwell Anderson, to be perfectly honest.
That's my point.
Yeah.
It is better to be, and not just rescue or salvage, it's better to be a first-class critic, if you can be, than a second or third-rate artist. Excuse me.
But a critic is something you are on the side. You are something else before that. Like Coleridge was a great critic.
And a great
But he was
artist.
mainly a great poet. There's sometimes the two are combined. But
T.S. Eliot,
the main thing,
Pebble, everything.
Well, that's sort of a tradition that we've lost, in which artists would routinely write. In the 19th century, most great artists wrote criticism.
Dr. Johnson, on the other hand, did more criticism, but he was a fine poet.
As well.
A novelist, too.
Vanity of Human Wishes.
I think one shouldn't cut off these departments in an arbitrary way. One isn't a born critic. One may be a born poet. But a critic is a subsidiary thing. I tended to think that for me, it should be done for a certain time. I mean, theater reviewing. I left off after 4 years without being fired, and not because I wasn't earning enough money, but because I didn't want to do it anymore. I wanted to put my energies into some other aspect of theater.
Big loss. It was a big loss for him. It was a big loss when you stopped writing theater criticism. It really was. It was a shock to the theater community.
2 more. Okay. One of 2 more. Okay.
Thanks. Hi. My name is Leela. I'm a friend of Roger Copeland's. It's been a real privilege for me to be Roger's friend for many years. He's really taught me a lot about theater. I'm not a theater person myself, and it's been a privilege to hear you speak today. So I want to thank you for that, first of all. My question has to do with value, and you've mentioned several times, and I've heard this brought up in several discussions about theater, the price of tickets, and how it's the tourists that can afford Broadway, and those are the people that are going. But I wanted to just bring your attention to what I see as another element. First of all, Broadway isn't the only theater, in New York. There's off-Broadway, which is not cheap. It's maybe, say, $50 or so. And that is more affordable. But there are a lot of people who live here who are very bright, who are not what you'd call the tourists, but they choose to spend their money on other things. And these are people that will spend money on music, a lot of money on music. They will spend money on very expensive jeans. I mean, I say that, I'm somebody who is, I grew up on Levi's, and I don't spend $150 on jeans. A lot of people who used to be considered frivolous people, serious people, spend a lot of money on clothes and martinis. They are choosing, they could go to the theater more. They are valuing other things over the theater. It's not just the money. And I think when you say that every time, you're getting away from something, which is that people have decided that could go to the theater not to go. And it's very sad for me. I grew up in New York. My parents were interested in theater. And I realized at a certain point, I stopped going except with people like Roger, because I have to go alone if I want to go to the theater. And I don't really want to go to the alone. I'm 46. I don't really want to go by myself anymore. I have friends who are they don't want to do that. They want to go to films, which are $15, are not that cheap, and they want to do other things, and they don't want to make the time. Like, you can go to a movie at 2, 4, 5, 7 on any day of the week. You have to plan in advance to be there at that date and time. So I'm really seeing it as a value, and I wanted to get your response to that.
Thank you.
Okay, and then at least one more question to my left. But
we have two more questions.
Okay. But let me see if there's a response from anybody about people simply choosing not to go to the theater, or choosing to do other things with whatever
or choosing not to
liquidity
be
they have. Yeah.
After I stopped being a regular theater critic, my wife and I paid to go to a play. Paid. I felt like a sinner doing it. We were sitting there with my knees against the seat in front of me, in this narrow seat, very unlike the film theaters. I said to my wife, my God, I'm paying more to spend 2 hours in this space than I paid for a month's rent when we were first married.
Which reminds me that it just suddenly occurred to me that there are more new theaters being built today. I don't know what's going to be in them, but a lot of new buildings are going up. The Guthrie's got a new building. There's been 2 or 3 new buildings in Boston. There's a new building here. Baryshnikov has put up a theater.
Jeffrey Horowitz is trying.
Jeffrey Horowitz is going to build a new theater in Brooklyn. Must be some hunger stimulating this.
Either that or the edifice complex, which is...
I think that the theaters are more aware, Broadway and off-Broadway are more aware of what the last speaker said than they're being given credit for. There's a lot of discussion going on now about new business models, new ways of reaching ticket purchasers. Subscriptions are being de-emphasized in favor of these email assaults that I'm sure all of you have gotten, and if they've gotten to all of you, you know that they're getting better lists. These discount codes that are being sent to you are a sign that the theaters are very conscious that last-minute buying is much more important than it was before. I think there's more flexibility going on right now in trying to adjust to the new scene than maybe people are conscious of. Also, I spent 6 years, God help me, as chair of the theater department, trying to figure out how my students were going to afford to go to the theater. The opportunities that were sent our way were extraordinary. I think that something very important was learned by John Leguizamo's Freak, which was made available for, I think, $13. And this message that came from not just me, but from everybody who runs the theater program in this city, that $15 tops, and you will fill those seats with young people, has finally, I think, started to get across. And I do think that with a moderate investigation, you can find a way to get your students in for either free or very little money. So I just think that there's a little bit more going on behind the scenes to try and address this.
You call $15 very little money for a student?
I think that $15, at least for our students, was the limit.
Right.
I don't know about it. You know, a movie now is $11.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
We have one
Okay.
one there and then one question here.
Okay.
This is really more a comment than a question. I was so delighted to hear the three of you speak. Professor Brustein, you left Columbia right when I was going in, so I never got a chance to take a class with you, but I was a Barnard student. I was in lots of productions that Kenneth Janes, if you remember his name, used to do. We did Shakespeare. I can, recite stuff from Margaret of Anjou, and I'm a doctor. And that was a long time ago. You have to catch people young, I think. Theater hunger is there. But if you don't have a taste of it, then you don't know what you're hungry for. And I think that's tremendously important that we have to get children, young children. I mean, I grew up in the 50s. We had a record player. It was middle-brow stuff. Some of it was low-brow. But I could tell you all the lyrics to every song in My Fair Lady and most of the dialogue of the parts that weren't music. And I was hungry for it. And when I was a resident in psychiatry, the first time I really had any money, my favorite way of taking a vacation was to get 7 theater tickets, mostly Broadway. And the best thing was to go on Wednesday to a matinee, then have dinner out and go to another show. If the hunger is there, then you've got a potential audience, but there has to be things that people
has to be a habit of theater.
We haven't talked either about the cutting off of funds for arts in the schools.
And we don't talk about theater at dinner parties anymore.
For that reason, the kids are not being exposed to it.
People don't go.
The first thing they do is they fire the music teacher when they're out of funds. When I was a kid, I was an 8-year-old. My parents took me to see something called Swinging the Dream. And it was a black version of the Midsummer Night's Dream. It had Bojangles' Bill Robinson as Oberon. It had Louis Armstrong as Bottom. It had the most incredible cast. Benny Goodman was one of the pit orchestras. I sat there absolutely entranced. The next morning, it was reviewed, and the critics panned it. And I learned 3 things. Number 1, never trust the daily critics. Number 2, that there's nice things to be done with the classics, other than just putting them on straight. And number 3, that there's a relationship between music and the arts and the art of drama. So I knew that as an 8-year-old because I was exposed to it. I never would have known it if I hadn't been taken to the theater.
Just another thing about young children. My daughter, who's now 20, started at the age of 7 in the Lucy Moses Music Theater Workshop, which does mostly musical stuff. They write their own plays appropriate for each age group and their own songs, and it's a wonderful organization. But the perk is that each group gets a chance to go to a Broadway show for free. The organization takes them. So, and again, I know that this was not the level of theater that you were talking about, but I think it's a way of exciting children, The big perk, I got to go to a Broadway show when I'm 7 years old.
Absolutely, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I think this might be the last question, so it better be good. So,
I realize that I'm Dr. Bertram Rosen. I'm a psychiatrist. Back to Mr. Kauffmann's point about something missing. I think what's missing is what McCarthyism took out of American intellectual life.
There is a good,
and it's also an explanation for the decline of criticism, I think. Please comment.
Well, to your point, there's no vital alternative now to this snake swallowing its own tail of sheer greed. It's part of what McCarthy helped to destroy.
I think
Marxism is dead, as you said.
Well, Marxism is not dead.
Theater, well, he said it. I disagree with him.
Marxism is.
And therefore, the theater is dying. Thanks a lot.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tatey's events is available at philiptateys.org.